I'm going to talk today about two early African American subjects. First, the Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, and you'll be hearing more about him later. And second, my longtime subjects, William and Ellen Craft. Shameless plug for my book, Love, Liberation, and Escaping Slavery, that came out 2 years ago. The Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford is one of my newest research projects, and I want to thank a person unknown. I'm calling this person, really this is a person unremembered, because many years ago, when I was in the throes of earnestly trying to complete my 17-year project on William and Ellen Craft, I received an email from a colleague with an attachment that was an article from the Birmingham, England Mail, which is a local commercial newspaper. This was a contemporary 21st century article, and the article focused on this early African American named Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford. I'd never heard of the Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, and the person who I don't remember who emailed me this notice figured that I hadn't heard of Stanford because neither had he or she, and thought I would be interested. I have a tactile memory of that day. I remember printing out dutifully the article, sending a short email to my colleague, and basically I said, wow, this dude has an interesting haircut. I love to learn more about him, but I've got to finish this book. And I remember putting the article in one of my renowned purple file folders, labeling it Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford Future Project, and setting it aside. As soon as I finished my book on William and Ellen Craft, my monograph on the crafts, that is, I pulled this file folder out of the file box. My cabinet is too full now. I have boxes now of files. And I decided to pursue this subject. And I'll be speaking more about him and showing you some images of him with his arresting and very modern hairstyle later. I wish I had copied the email. I only copied the article, so I don't remember who sent it to me, and I've quizzed so many of my friends and colleagues, and none of them remember either. So this is a salutary reminder to all of us who are researchers to think about how we will archive our emails. Speaking of archives, I wish I had archived that. Finally, I want to begin again with some paratextual information, a series of shout-outs to my colleagues in a very collaborative community of 19th century American literature researchers. At that particular moment in my field, 19th century American literary studies, those of us in my field considered the work that we did a very solitary pursuit. I am here to tell all of you, but particularly the students in the room, that I'm very happy to report to you that what we do is collaborative, now more than ever. No one works in isolation. And I want to give a shout out to all the groups around me that have facilitated my research on the crafts and Stanford, and who continue to inspire me. These collaborations include, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they include the Civil War Caucus of the Midwest Modern Language Association, under the leadership of Kathleen Diffley, the Society for the Study of American Women Writers, and I want to call attention for you to a recent special issue, co-edited, notice the co there, by Caroline Gebhardt, Sandra Zagarel, and Catherine Adams, on an early African-American woman writer, Alice Dunbar Nelson, whose work has been seriously understudied for too long. And their work is generative, ongoing, and it's meant to encourage more of us to study Alice Dunbar Nelson. I want to shout out to my longtime colleague and collaborator, the phenomenal, one-of-a-kind, one-of-the-one, as Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, Joycelyn Moody, Professor Joycelyn Moody, who is now in the process of editing an 18-volume series from Cambridge University Press telling the story of African American literature from the 18th century to now. Phenomenal, phenomenal work. I'd like to shout out to the Colored Conventions Project, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Smithsonian Institution. I don't know where you'll be on February 14. I hope it's in the arms of a loved one or a group of loved ones. I'll be celebrating the birthday of the inimitable Freddie D. Frederick Douglass, and my institution, the University of Georgia, will join 49 other colleges and universities around the country. I hope Emory is one of them. And we're going to spend the afternoon in honor of Frederick Douglass having birthday cake and punch and transcribing Freedmen's Bureau papers for the Smithsonian Institution so that the institution, in collaboration with the Colored Conventions Project, can digitize, finally, all of the Freedmen's Bureau papers. I'm really excited about that. I'm shouting out to all three of these contemporary entities, particularly to P. Gabrielle Foreman and Sarah Patterson, who are among the leadership of the Colored Conventions Project. And of course, I wouldn't study what I study if I couldn't shout out to Freddie D. Wherever Freddie D. is, that's what we lovingly call him in my world of 19th century American literature studies. Wherever Frederick Douglass is, happy birthday. And finally, I'm going to step out of the world of archives and research and send a shout out to the Southern Poverty Law Center. It might not immediately come to mind when we think about the 19th century, but the Southern Poverty Law Center has recently published a short, about 25 to 30 pages, I think, booklet for teachers on how to teach slavery. I see some of you nodding. I've skimmed it. It's phenomenal. I certainly am going to change some of the questions that I ask, some of the ways that I present slavery. The Southern Poverty Law Center is spearheading a national project to put more thoughtful, reflective, and comprehensive discussion of the period of enslavement in our public schools. This booklet is geared to K-12 teachers, but I read pretty much everything that the Southern Poverty Law Center publishes, including their magnificent Teaching Tolerance magazine. And I can tell you, college professors in the room, that you can learn too. We always have room for improvement in the classroom. All right, enough of the shout outs. Now I'm going to talk. An ongoing project of scholars has been to recover the lives of African Americans in an archive that, writes the historian Lois Brown, is replete with rhetorical ruptures and biographical caesuras. For many of us, the slaves' narratives have been well-known, accessible windows into written accounts of such early African Americans' lives and loves and loving relationships. Because of their experiences of trauma during bondage and/or their desires to conceal private details from public scrutiny, or because of anxieties that white interlocutors would misrepresent, caricature, or ridicule them, the authors of these accounts frequently veiled or withheld familial and social intimacies. To fill these discursive silences, literary anthologies such as Francis Smith Foster's Love and Marriage in Early African America and Henry Louis Gates and Hollis Robinson's recently published Portable 19th Century American Women Writers have scoured pamphlets and periodical literature, correspondence and letters, and prose and poetry. They have recovered the panoply of African Americans' loving voices, lost, found, scorned, and avowed during the centuries of enslavement through the turn into the 20th century. Between these contemporary projects and the early canon-building endeavors of the Library of Congress's Daniel Alexander Payne Murray, the bibliophiles Arturo Alfonso Schomburg of New York and Robert Mara Adger of Philadelphia, and W.E.B. Du Bois in his role as cultural worker during the 1900 Paris Exposition, the historical record has yielded a trove of text about African American loves and lives in printed, published, publicly circulated formats. And here is a cover page from the Colored American magazine featuring a still photograph of Du Bois. There he is in the lower left-hand corner among the panoply of materials that he assembled for the 1900 Paris Exposition. What do African American relationships look like in the early black print archive? Even though productions may be orphaned, fragmented, or decontextualized, they can provide entry into meaningful discussion of how such early relationships of intimacy and affection articulate both empowering and stressful aspects of social and political struggle. The limited circulating and one-time publications of two formerly enslaved persons and transatlantic citizens, the Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford of Hampton, Virginia, and Ellen Craft of Macon, Georgia, demonstrate that such early subjects understood how connections of love and friendship mattered in the context of racial politics. To locate and critique such productions is an important project that demonstrates how African Americans collaborated strategically to attain the promises of liberation and to pass down cultural values amid the realities and challenges of racial violence, economic instability, and physical separation and displacement. And now you know what I mean by the interesting, I should say arresting hairstyle. I think it's a very contemporary hairstyle. Image of the Reverend Stanford, the Good Reverend, circa 1890s. And then adjacent to it is actually a plaque that hangs on the wall of the former church that he pastored in Birmingham, England. It was known as Hope Chapel in the 1880s. He was the first black minister of Birmingham, England. Now he is, his chapel is called Highgate Baptist Church. And as an aside, I am currently working on an edition of Reverend Stanford's materials published and circulated in 3 countries with a graduate student, Sidonia Serafini at the University of Georgia, and I'm very proud to say I'm also working on this edition with the current pastor of Reverend Stanford's old church in Birmingham, England, the Reverend Paul Walker. It's a really cool project. Enjoying it. but I get ahead of myself. Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, M.A., M.D., D.D., LL.D., was born into American slavery. He was separated from his mother Caroline at their Hampton, Virginia plantation home sometime during the Union Army's march through that state. A group of Native Americans, likely members of the Pamunkey Nation of the Powhatan Confederacy, raised Reverend Stanford for 2 years until Quaker missionaries and Hampton University educators plucked him from this community and delivered him to live with a white Boston family who gave him their surname, Stanford. And that's not the whole story. I'm just painting it in broad brushstrokes. It's incredible. Stanford's travels after the Civil War and Reconstruction during a 20-plus year career retraced the transatlantic roots of such celebrated black abolitionists as William Ellen Craft, Father Josiah Henson, William Wells Brown, the Craft's friend and mentor, and Frederick Douglass. Like them, Stanford traveled in over 20 years from the United States to Canada to the British Isles, England, Ireland, Wales, and back again. For 2 years, Stanford preached in Canada's fugitive slave settlements, 1881 to 83. For 12 years, he pastored Hope Chapel, what is now Highgate Baptist Church, in downtown Birmingham, England's Afro-Caribbean community. And that was from 1883 to 1895. And if you know your Frederick Douglass, you know that 1895 is an important date, because that is the day, that is the year, the date that Frederick Douglass passes away. Frederick Douglass is a great hero of Reverend Stanford, and he provides a motif. Look for him throughout my talk. He coheres my talk. In 1895, when Douglass passed away, Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, like James Baldwin in Europe, felt called to come back to the United States to do his liberatory work. And he came back to live and work in a variety of places: Cambridge, Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, Baltimore, Maryland, and Auburn, New York. And if you know your 19th century, you know that Auburn, New York is deeply associated with none other than Harriet Tubman during her final years, where she founds a home for senior citizens. Stanford's life is constantly intersecting with these celebrated abolitionists, and deliberately so. Throughout these years, Stanford serves as an educator, minister, orphanage director, and anti-lynching activist, among other things. And I'm going to scroll through some slides. Here is Stanford in the frontispiece from one of his last 3 iterations of his memoir, and a compendious history of African Americans that he called The Tragedy of the Negro, published 3 times in 1897, 1898, and 1903. There he is. This is how he wants to be remembered. Educator, minister, philanthropist, activist, and remember this, it's important, man with 4 degrees. Sorry, Reverend. Only a few extant copies of Reverend Stanford's first publication, The Plea of the Ex-Slaves Now in Canada, are held in library collections worldwide. Like Mary Ann Shadd, editor of the Provincial Freeman out of Canada West in what is now Ontario, Stanford also edited a now lost Ontario newspaper called The Christian Defender. And I'm emphasizing the now lost, while I have scoured every possible Ontario archive. Can't find it, doesn't mean it's not there. Like Mary Ann Shadd's 1852, A Plea for Emigration, or Notes of Canada West in its moral, social, and political aspect, Stanford's Plea of the Ex-Slaves Now in Canada, published in 1885, noted the successes of Canada's fugitive slave communities in building religious institutions and contributing to farming and commerce, while it also acknowledged the suspicions and tensions between this diaspora and their white Canadian neighbors. However, where Shadd encouraged young African Americans to forego West Indian and Mexican colonization schemes in favor of joining the more populous African Canadian settlements, Stanford sought greener pastures for young African Americans outside of North America altogether. He published and circulated his pamphlet in England as a fundraising initiative to train the children of North and South Buxton, London, Hamilton, and other fugitive settlements in Canada for global Christian missionary work in India and Africa. Not without controversy, Black abolitionists like William Wells Brown and Frederick Douglass and the crafts abolitionists Stanford admired had sold merchandise such as photographs and engravings at their anti-slavery lectures, and or they had charged admission fees. So too did Stanford follow this model by promoting sales of his photograph, his orations, and he had plenty of them by 1885, and his plea in order to financially support, quote, a farm in Canada on which to build an institution for neglected and orphaned children of ex-slaves to educate them with a view of sending them to Africa for missionary work, end quote. Stanford crammed his plea of the ex-slaves now in Canada, a hybrid transatlantic text with testimonials about and notices of its publication from the British and American press, with English and Algonquian lyrics of English hymns. Remember I told you he'd spent time with Native Americans? He also crammed this pamphlet with a sermon and with a 19-page memoir, the first of several of his memoirs that he would compose and publish over his short career. I've shown you the title page to your left of Stanford's plea. As you can see, it's crammed with information. I'm not expecting you to be able to read it from where you sit. What I'd like you to do is just take in how similar typographically the title page of his plea is to the title page of Frederick Douglass. And remember, I told you he's a great admirer of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, Life and Times, published just a few years earlier in 1882. This just struck me a few weeks ago as I was putting together my talk. The takeaway from Stanford's title page is his showmanship, because we're going to circle back to that later. I want you to note, even if you can't see it, that Stanford writes his name as Reverend, R-E-V period, P period, T period, Stanford. And if you've gone to The Greatest Showman, the film, or you've had young people in your life and taking them there, you know where I'm going with this, right? P.T. Stanford, P.T. Barnum. And I don't think it's a stretch to think that Stanford wasn't considering that relationship. Most of this material, the long paragraphs, particularly toward the bottom, have to do with all of the material that he's selling in conjunction with his book. He's selling cabinet cards representing himself. He's selling carte de visite, which are smaller photographs representing himself. All of these can be bought to raise money, again, to send the youth to Africa. And I love the final line before the copyright information: please do not lend this book If you do, we lose a sale. So he's very much of the mind that he's going to make money to send the young people of the African Canadian formerly enslaved settlements to Africa. Marriage lines had not been introduced at the time when my father and mother were married, Stanford notes in his memoir, and I'm quoting from his first memoir in this book, The Plea. In fact, I'm quoting Stanford, the children of the slaves were the only certificate slave couples had. Stanford's life had begun with what Lloyd Pratt, in his study, Archives of American Time, Literature and Modernity in the 19th Century, describes as the enslaved person's experience of natal alienation. In other words, because of the ruptures in his family, which predated and followed his arrival into the world, and because of his owner's written documentation of the so-called property he held, which was attenuated, vague, and ambiguous, Stanford seemed destined never to know the complete story about his ancestry, including the date and place of his nativity or birth. According to studies by the historians Michaela Adams, Helen Roundtree, and Erica Coleman, a formerly enslaved child like Stanford would also have been very lucky, as he was, to have been accepted by one of the local Native communities, as he claims to have been during the Civil War. By the middle of the century, such Native communities were under pressure by the federal government to distance themselves from African Americans, or else risk losing land and sovereignty. A 19-page booklet printed in 1894 by the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, called The Pamunkeys of Virginia by John Garland Pollard, confirms that by the late 1880s, tribal law forbade the intermarriage of a member with anyone other than a white person or a fellow Indian, under penalty of forfeiting their rights in the nation. Pollard wrote that no member of the Pamunkey tribe is of full Indian blood. There has been considerable intermixture of white blood in the tribe, and not a little of that of the Negro, though the laws of the tribe now strictly prohibit marriage of persons to African descent. Though they would probably acknowledge the whites as their equals, the Pamunkey consider the blacks far beneath their social level. They are exceedingly anxious to keep their blood free from further intermixture with that of other races. In fact, wrote Pollard, the Pamunkey leadership had refused to accept an African-American teacher who had been assigned by the state of Virginia to teach in the tribal school. Therefore, while Stanford's light skin and youth may have made him palatable as a companion and community member during the 1860s, as an adult searching for lost kin 2 decades later, he would have encountered very likely more hostility from the members of this Native American tribe. So Stanford in the 1880s, when he's, rather 1870s, when he's looking for his lost mother and his sister, he's thwarted because even though he finds his old master didn't keep good records, and he's thwarted because the Pamunkeys don't want to have much of anything to do with African Americans, and they certainly don't want to admit that they had a moment in their history where they were freely admitting enslaved African Americans into their ranks. So Stanford created a family of his own. He courted and married Beatrice Mabel Stickley, an English shoemaker's daughter, and they had a daughter, Caroline, who he named after his lost mother. Once Beatrice passed away after untimely illness, Stanford married an African-American music teacher, Marie Elizabeth Matthews, and they lived together very unhappily. That's a long and sad newspaper, press-written story. Yet, Stanford never stopped grieving for his first love, his first wife, Beatrice, And they are buried together in an unmarked plot in the Cambridge, Massachusetts cemetery near the former home school and orphanage for women and girls and migrants from the South that he and Beatrice, in their later years in the 1880s, co-founded and sustained. Joining so many African Americans divided by the commerce of slavery, Stanford persisted in searching for the mother he had lost during the chaos of Civil War. You thought I was going to talk about love in a certain way. I'm talking about love a little differently here. I'm the trickster. Heather Andrea Mitchell's study, Help Me to Find My People, demonstrates how Stanford's quest for his mother joined thousands of such relentless searches, many of which continued through the early 20th century. Online digital collaborations such as Villanova University and Mother Bethel AME Church's Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, and Louisiana State University's Lost Friends online exhibition, which collect information wanted ads by 19th century family members, give lie to slavery's rationale that Black people were indifferent to bonds of blood and affection, unmoved by the loss of loved ones to the auction block, and immured to the sight of coffles of bound Black bodies trundled by steamer to labor downriver. Stanford was one of the lucky ones. Sometime between his departure from Virginia in the 1860s and his admission into the Baptist faith, formally in the 1870s, he located and reconnected with his beloved mother, Caroline. His memoir, inserted in his plea of the ex-slaves, features one precious letter directed to him from her, the only known correspondence in the archives out of the regular exchange he claims they kept up once he found her. In this letter, his natal narrative of omission and absence gives way to themes of cultural connection and retention. Caroline repeats her desire to reunite with him and his sister Rachel, a dream deferred because of her declining health. She writes, "I often wish I could see you all once more together." She writes, "I am not well, but hope to see you, and before I am called from this world." Stanford was too indigent to fund a visit, and his mother died, her hope unrequited, a few weeks, he writes, after he received this letter. In light of his loss, her letter presents as the equivalent of a last will and testament, bequeathing to Stanford, her son, an inheritance that we readers initially may miss. "I wish it was that we could aid you in defraying your expenses while pursuing your studies," she states. But times are like they are everywhere, dull. So she has no money to give him. She knows he wants to become a minister. He's assumed 3 jobs to work his way through the Connecticut Literary Institute to get a divinity degree. So we read poverty and indigence in this letter, and I'm asking us to read something else that is very rich and wealthy. Caroline's understated selection of the word dull speaks volumes about the violence, disenfranchisement, silencing, and financial insecurity that rural Black Virginians faced as the end of Reconstruction ushered in Jim Crow, and against which her own son would do battle. Early in his own career, for example, Stanford would become a spokesperson for England's chapter of the anti-racist, anti-lynching Society for the Recognition of the Universal Brotherhood of Man. Caroline's decision to downplay the family troubles, to withhold worrisome details from her son, and to represent in nostalgic tones farming life, and here she mentions strawberry season, pea picking rounds, potato digging time. All of these decisions gesture to another intention. She is dying, as she writes or dictates this letter. She states that the times are dull. Nothing good to be found in Hamilton, Virginia at this time. Yet her statement that all, and you can see it there, third from the bottom of the letter, all join me in sending love to you, is an unambiguous signal of a gift to her son, of community and belonging as buffers against inevitable loss and struggle. And here I'm going to jump into the 21st century. That statement is an articulation of something very similar that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in his Between the World and Me, his memoir. He writes, I didn't always have things, but I had people. And then he writes in italics, but I always had people. And I find this statement an evocation of that the gift that African Americans like Caroline can give to her struggling son, struggling out of the impoverishment of enslavement, is not a material gift. It's the wealth of community. That's what she's talking about here. That's what she's bequeathing him, the wealth of people. Because I'm a literature major, we are going to redact this letter and revisit it. Here it is illuminating to pause and to reread, to revisit Caroline's letter with the backstory that her son, do you remember how he signed his title page? Not Peter Thomas, but PT. PT was an inventive storyteller and what my editor at UGA Press calls an habitual prevaricator. I tell my students, that means liar. And it's true. It's true. For instance, we cannot authenticate Stanford's claim in his first memoir, and he repeats this throughout his life in newspapers and orations, that he was the first African-American student to graduate the Connecticut Literary Institute in Suffield. Not only can we not verify that, but there's at least one other African-American in the archives who makes the claim and can substantiate it. We cannot prove Stanford's assertion in the plea or subsequent memoirs that he had earned 4 degrees. Remember those degrees? MD, DD, LLD, right. He also claims, we cannot substantiate, that he attended the Oxford University. And I have to say, I spent some time at the Oxford University in the spring of 2016, going through the Oxford University archives at the Bodleian Library. Nobody could find Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford. That doesn't mean it isn't true. We just can't substantiate it. Nor can we substantiate his claims in the last 3 of his memoirs, embedded in his opus magnus, The Tragedy of the Negro, that he had met, among other celebrities, the Queen of England, the Prince of Wales, and the British Prime Minister William Gladstone. If you're going to go, go big, right? Nor, it doesn't end, nor can we verify on a local scale that his mother Caroline learned to read and write after bondage. I'm not suggesting this letter is a lie. I'm just suggesting that, again, we step back, put on our researcher hats, and understand that she may have dictated this letter to someone else. And this letter may have been subject to revision, not only by the person who wrote the letter down for her, but also by PT himself. We cannot know, in other words, whether the archive is true or false. To take Caroline's letter at face value, word for word or not. Like an optical illusion that at first glance resembles a rabbit, and then, when scrutinized sideways, has morphed into a human profile, Caroline's letter appears as studied as it is spontaneous. Her sweet sentiments about reunion and return frame conflicting yet loving hints, and I'm bold-facing what I think are the hints. To stay away, stay out, move up, and move on. I hope business may be brisk this year, so you can earn enough to complete your course of studies. Stay away. I wish it was that so we could aid you in defraying your expenses while pursuing your studies, but times are like they are everywhere, dull. Stay away. Keep going. Don't come back. If her son desires to become a celebrated author, if he desires to become a paragon of uplift and aspiration, he will not achieve the dream of his pamphlet's title page, to groom the freed people and fugitives to evangelize in Africa by staying in post-Reconstruction Hamilton, Virginia. And there is an example of his activism. As I mentioned later on, Stanford becomes an internationally celebrated anti-lynching activist, inspired by the 2 tours of England that Ida Wells makes. And this is an example of one of his publications, a broadside that he published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1890s and circulated in the British and American press, as well as in his 3 books, The Tragedy. All right, so more Ellen Craft. And there is Ellen Craft embedded on the cover page of the Illustrated London News of April 1851. The daughter of a white planter and the woman he had enslaved, Ellen Craft escaped bondage in mid-century Georgia. She disguised as a white Southern gentleman and slaveholder, and accompanied by her husband William, who pretended to be his master's property. She traveled on carriages, rail cars, and steamers in 1848 to freedom in Philadelphia. After 2 years in Boston, the Crafts would spend 19 years in England, where they wrote personal letters to British and American anti-slavery allies, public correspondence to British and American newspapers, and notes about finances and domestic life to their children and their friends. The best-selling memoir of Ellen's escape from slavery with William, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, is inflected by themes of reunion, love, and loss. They published their memoir in 1860 and 1861, again, to use earnings from its sales to support the anti-slavery cause, to raise money to educate their children, and this is the most important for this discussion today, they published their memoir in order to finance searches for relatives lost and left behind down south. I mentioned that they stayed in England for 19 years. Those of you who know the story know they circled back after 19 years in England to the American South. And while their ostensible reason, which they followed through with, was to establish schools for the freed people, I believe that an unspoken, at least unpublicly stated reason was that they were still searching for lost loved ones so long after the war. Who were these lost loved ones? William's mother, Ellen's mother, and William's brother and sister. At least those are the ones we know are missing from what they tell us in the archive. This goal, as Ezra Greenspan writes in his biography of William Wells Brown, was one which many celebrated black activists pursued with effectiveness during the Civil War and Reconstruction. In 1864, for example, Frederick Douglass united with his emancipated and once lost sister. In 1867, Harriet Jacobs, if you've read her narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, you know her work. In 1867, Jacobs, whose narrative had been brought out in England by the same publisher responsible for the Crafts memoir, returned to North Carolina, where she also reunited with formerly enslaved family members in Edenton. Ellen Craft, while temporarily ensconced in England, also succeeded in finding her mother, Maria Smith. The two had been separated back in Georgia when their master, James Smith, had presented Ellen as a wedding gift to his daughter, Eliza, incidentally her own half-sister. According to Ezra Greenspan, Craft, Ellen Craft that is, possibly contacted the Liberator's editor, William Lloyd Garrison, who connected with General James Wilson, garrisoned with Union troops in Georgia, who found Ellen's mother and helped facilitate her passage to England. As I write in my study of the Crafts, titled Love, Liberation, and Escaping Slavery, In 1865, the British newspaper, the Newcastle Courant, reported on Ellen's reunion day with her mother. And the Courant described, quote, a trembling, pale-faced, ladylike Ellen, end quote, her firstborn son by her side, greeting, quote, that parent so dear to them, who seemed like one risen from the dead. No known archive or repository holds letters or notes that Ellen and William composed to or for each other. Yes, I have spoken to family members in 2 countries. No one knows where there might be this correspondence. I pass that baton to those of you young researchers in the room. I believe they're out there. So no known archive or repository holds letters between William and Ellen. Yet, like Peter Thomas Stanford, they became regular correspondents to their fellow anti-slavery activists, writing back and forth across the Atlantic. My first major journal article, an essay for African American Review titled Yours Very Truly, Ellen Craft, The Fugitive as Text and Artifact, analyzed an open letter which Ellen Craft wrote in 1852 and published widely in British and American newspapers. The letter was meant to vindicate her character and her commitment to remain a free woman. The letter was meant to beat back rumors that she wished to return to bondage in the United States South, and it situated her and William within received conventions of marriage, gender, and culture. I concluded in my early analysis that this letter inscribes Ellen Craft, and I'm quoting, and remember, I'm just out of graduate school, so I'm wording here. The letter's goal is to inscribe Ellen as, quote, a married woman, as if to demolish outstanding suspicions that as a female of African descent, fraught by the stereotypes of blackness, she might prove to be a fraudulent daughter, a negligent mother, and an adulterous wife. Ellen Craft indicates that no innate inclination among enslaved women prevents them from nurturing children and securing homes and husbands. Rather, it is the institution of enslavement that excludes these activities. Enslavement, Ellen Craft's letter indicates, excoriates African women for not possessing the qualities of womanhood and domesticity that it then prevents them from obtaining. So Ellen is trying to make visible this paradox of enslavement, even as she is trying to write herself firmly into the British middle class. Again, I'm going to back up, I'm going to rewind, as Usher says, and revisit my earlier comments. My earlier analysis focused on what Ellen's letter says, but what is not mentioned in her letter and the paratext around it, what the rhetoric of attainment, I've achieved womanhood, finally conceals, is her and her husband William's urgent, pressing quest to complete the family circle that freedom on English soil has promised. We can find among the phrases of both the paratext and the letter phrases such as deserted, she had deserted her husband, repetition of verbs meaning return. We can find in this language what literary critics call markers of a present absence, markers of those loved ones who have been lost and left behind, and into whose arms she and William would love to be restored. These rhetorical choices complicate this letter's rosy tone of fulfillment and togetherness. They contextualize Black love within an ongoing freedom struggle. So if I were to write this essay again, I would certainly call attention to how Ellen demonstrates that I have arrived, finally, into middle-class womanhood. I always was there. Slavery prevented me from asserting myself as the woman I am. But I would also call attention to the ideas, the themes, the tropes of loss that her letter implies. I will conclude by discussing another recovery very quickly in the archive that articulates Ellen's letters' themes of loss and longing. Last semester, the historian Richard Blackett, whose essay, The Odyssey of William and Ellen Craft, is groundbreaking and exhaustive and certainly has inspired my own work. Last semester, Professor Blackett shared with me a notice from the Vicksburg, Mississippi Whig, WHIG, Civil War era newspaper. An ad dated December 18, 1852, coincident with this letter, and reprinted June 8, 1852, was placed by the slave-dealing firm of Bolton, Dickens and Company, which was based in Richmond, Mobile, Lexington, Memphis, New Orleans, Charleston, Jefferson City, and Vicksburg. This is 1852. Slavery is alive and well in the South. This advertisement offers $500 reward, about $4,000 today, for the return of an escaped African-American blacksmith named Charles. Remember that. Traveling under forged free papers. Charles is, quote, a dark mulatto, about 6 feet, about 32 years old, quick-spoken, very intelligent, with a burn about the size of $1 on his arm between the wrist and the elbow. He is suspected in the ad of having headed to New Orleans, where he has a free sister, and to have disappeared into one of the interior towns in Mississippi until the coast clears. And here is the clinker. The ad's final sentence identifies this runaway, this fugitive, this Charles, as, quote, a brother of the celebrated William Craft, who made his escape from Macon, Georgia, to London, end quote. In the December 23rd, 1852 National Anti-Slavery Standard, William Craft had proudly announced the birth of the couple's first son, the son that Ellen Craft alluded to in her letter. They named their son Charles Estlin Phillips Craft. William stated that they had named their son after the Bristol, England reformer John Bishop Estlin and after the American lawyer and abolitionist Wendell Phillips, bringing the two transatlantic movements together. Until I read this ad, I had interpreted this explanation of naming as an homage to those transatlantic activist networks, to the community of reformers in both the United States and England that had facilitated the Crafts' freedom. Now I see, again, this is why we circle back always as researchers. Now I see the private pain occluded, made invisible in Ellen's letter, that the Crafts, possibly in naming their firstborn son, Charles, gestured to a disappeared but not forgotten loved one in naming their firstborn son. Thank you.